So let me start with our speaker panel, and let me invite our keynote to start, and that's Abigail Smith. We are very pleased to have Abigail with us. She is, I should start with this so you give her a warm welcome. She's actually a Red Sox fan. And her dad grew up in, she grew up in New Hampshire, in Baltimore. Her dad was a New Hampshire resident, and she actually got to meet with lots of Red Sox players when they were beating the Orioles. They'd come down to Baltimore, and she'd meet Jim Rice, and then he'd hit a homer, and all, yeah. Abigail was appointed Deputy Mayor for Education in April 2013. She has spent her entire professional career focused on improving quality, equity, and access in public education. Prior to her appointment, she served as an independent consultant, supporting a variety of reform-focused local and national organizations. She previously served as the Chief of Transformation Management for the District of Columbia's public schools. She spent 12 years with the Teach for America program, ultimately serving as Vice President of Research and Public Policy. She served as the VP of National Training and Support and as the Executive Director of Teach for America's Washington, D.C. site. She began her career as a first-grade teacher in Weldon, North Carolina. She received her bachelor's degree from Yale and a master's in education from Harvard. Abigail, thank you very much for being here. I look forward to your remarks.
Good evening, everybody. So here you are on a beautiful summer evening, sitting inside, not being able to are those actually windows, or are they just like supposed to look like windows? I don't know, to make us feel better. Well, I am really pleased to be here. I've got some notes on my iPad here. And it is always nice to be in a room where I share baseball affiliation with others. Doesn't always happen in DC. I am indeed a Red Sox fan, despite the fact that I've never lived in New England. And my husband is a die-hard Cleveland Indians fan. He grew up in Cleveland. We've got two boys, and when our son was about 4 years old, I guess the Nationals first came to town in DC when he was 3 or 4. He immediately became focused on listening to the games on the radio, et cetera. And one weekend there was a series between the Red Sox and the Indians, and every morning we would come downstairs and I would say, "Emmett, guess what? The Red Sox won." And Emmett would say, "Oh, yay." And then my husband would say, "What do you mean, yay?" And Emmett would say, "Oh, I'm sorry." And this went on for several days. And after about the third game, Emmett said, "Mommy is a Red Sox fan, Daddy is an Indians fan, and I am a Nationals fan." And that was that. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about what we're doing in DC, sort of where we've come and where we're headed. And I know that the various DC folk who are here will keep me honest on this. So there may be some questions and differences of opinion, and I welcome those conversations. A little bit about DC, for those of you who don't know it as well. It's actually sort of similar sized to Boston. We at this point have about 646,000 residents. And are growing actually at a reasonable clip. The city's changed a lot in recent years, and some of the patterns that you see in cities across the country. We have had trends in terms of in the late 60s and 70s and following on of extensive white flight from the city, followed by black middle class flight. And it's only been in recent years that we've begun growing again as a city, just to give you a little sense of what's going on more broadly. Families who had options to opt out of the public school system, we're doing that in various ways, whether it was by paying for private school if they had the means to do that, or by leaving the city and going elsewhere where they could find public school options that were better for them. I came to DC in 1994, so have seen a lot of the changes in both the city and in our education system along the way, and I have a number of different sort of hats that I've worn that provide me some perspective on what's happened in DC. So as Jim shared in terms of my background, I worked for many years for Teach for America, so was in the nonprofit sector, working with DC public schools, but from the outside as a nonprofit provider, and got to see, look through the window at an incredible amount of dysfunction and thought I could never work there. I then subsequently worked there and spent several years working at DCPS, first with Michelle Rhee, who came in 2007, and then with Kaya Henderson, who's the current chancellor, before leaving DCPS, taking a little break, and then coming back into this role now as deputy mayor for education in the city. So again, looking more broadly at some of what's going on in education in the city. I also had the opportunity to serve as the chair of a charter school board, the school that my kids currently attend, but was able to do that for a while, and so have been very engaged in the charter sector, both professionally and personally. My two boys that I mentioned earlier are in a public charter school, have also been in DCPS, so as a parent, I've experienced both public sectors in terms of schooling, and all of that is helpful perspective to bring to bear for this work. On the education front, we've had a few watershed moments that I want to focus on given the sort of topics of conversation that we're looking at today. There's certainly been lots of different things that have gone on, but one is the advent of public charter schools in DC in 1998, and we'll look a little bit at how some of those trends have gone. The second sort of big watershed moment I want to just highlight is in 2007, the Public Education Reform Amendment Act, which we call PARA in local speak, was passed, and that allowed the mayor to have authority directly over the school system. So until then, we had an elected school board, which was not functioning all that well. Is that the understatement of the century? And this allowed the mayor to have direct authority over the school system to hire and fire a school's chancellor directly and have that level of accountability to ensure that things moved in the school system. That shortly thereafter, we brought Michelle Rhee to lead the school system. And PARA did a couple of other things that actually have some impact on the charter sector as well, including that up until that point, DC, which, although we are not a state, we would like to be a state, we're not a state, we operate as a state in a number of ways, including that we get federal dollars for education in the same way that other states do. And up until PARA in 2007, the state education agency was embedded within DC public schools, the public school district. Now, before charters were around, and before 1998, that wasn't so crazy because there was one school district, the city was the state, was the school district, it was all the same thing, so it didn't really matter. But once public charter schools were on the scene, it was becoming increasingly bizarre, 9 years into public charter schools, that DCPS was acting as the state education agency with certain oversight and pass-through of dollars and that sort of thing to the public charter schools. So one of the things PARA did was separate out a separate entity to act as the state education agency. That's a little in the weeds, but wanted to just note that as well. And then the third thing that I wanted to note, so advent of charter schools, the PARA, and then the Pre-K Act, which was one of a number of legislative moves that have happened in recent years, but a significant one in 2008, actually led by then Council Chair Vincent Gray, who is currently our mayor, and really putting a stake in the ground for DC's commitment to pre-K in a really big way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. First, let's take a look at just public school enrollment. So what you've got here, this goes way back to 1970, and you can see the line at the left, it was just DCPS, so any public school students were in DCPS, and we had 145,000 kids in our public schools. Then, you know what happened. And we had just this incredible decline in terms of the number of kids in our system. And then you see that line starting in 98 where public charter schools come on the scene. And for some time, even with public charter schools, we were not seeing significant growth or any growth in our overall public school population. When we say public schools in DC, we mean DCPS and public charter schools. So when I say public school, I include charters in that. And so what we essentially were seeing for a number of years was any kid that a public charter school got was a kid that DCPS lost. So it was sort of a zero sum. In the last few years, we've seen what we think is a very heartening trend, which is both DCPS and public charter schools overall are increasing in enrollment. So both sectors are increasing. And there are a lot of things that we think contribute to that, but not insignificant is DC's commitment to pre-K. So we'll look at that a little bit. This actually shows you just a little bit better the more recent numbers. And that total public school number that is going up, again, fueled significantly by charter schools and the significant growth of charter schools for sure, but also by that little bit of an uphill that DCPS has seen for the last couple of years. And both the public charter school sector and DCPS are expecting an increase in enrollment again this coming year. So that's good for the city in all of the ways that you can imagine. But we also think it is the biggest indicator that families are seeing both DCPS and public charter schools as real options for them, those staying in the city and availing themselves of public school options. So we've sort of seen that shift in terms of the market share. And so incidentally, right now, public charter schools serve about 44% of our total public school population. So we're getting close to that 50-50. We expect that it'll go up a little bit, the share. So again, because both sectors are now growing, the share isn't changing as quickly, but it'll probably go up a little bit. I'd guess something like 45% in the coming year. During that time, we've also seen some growth, some significant growth in terms of our student performance. And I'll start out by echoing what Jim said, and then we're in a very different place, so and sort of rationing it down several levels, but we have a long way to go. And I never want anyone that I'm talking to about student achievement in DC to leave the conversation not realizing that I understand that, and all of us who are engaged in this work understand that. We have not remotely arrived. That said, we've seen some really substantial growth over time, and these last numbers are hot off the presses because this morning we just released our state test results at 10 a.m. I was in front of another crowd. So these are some pretty remarkable gains on a test that is standard, is comparable across all of those years. So we've had that same test throughout that period of time, and of course, we still have immense amount to go to reach the kind of proficiency levels that we certainly expect of our kids and that we owe our kids, but a lot of real improvement. And again, that improvement has been fueled by both DCPS and public charter schools. Public charter schools are outpacing DCPS in terms of overall performance in the city. There's about a 5% gap between DCPS and public charter schools, 5 percentage points in reading, and about 8 points in math. So public charter schools are outperforming, but I think those in the public charter school world would say that even with being a few percentage points higher than this, that higher than the state average, again, still a long way to go. DCPS is catching up a little bit because their growth the last couple of years has been a little bit faster than charter schools' growth, but we all still definitely have a long way to go. This just is this most recent years for those of you who haven't seen it yet on our DCPS folk. This is all statewide. basically flatten reading, but not sliding backwards and continuing to inch forward in math. Next year, we are going to be implementing the new PARCC assessment as part of our Common Core rollout. So as Scott Pearson, the executive director of the Public Charter School Board, said this morning, he was showing the graph of how public charter schools have performed, and it's this really nice increase over the years. And he said, I'm excited about the PARCC, and it's raising the bar, and it's exactly what we want to do for kids, but it's unfortunate because we're not going to be able to use that graph anymore. We expect proficiency rates to go down as we raise the bar. So pre-K. So one of the things that has we believe, and we've got some good evidence on this on both fronts, has fueled both that increase in enrollment that I talked about, and this increase in student performance is an immense investment that we have made in pre-K in DC. So if you look at the enrollment numbers between the 2006-07 school year and then this school year that just finished, this is 3- and 4-year-olds. So these are students who are enrolled in public schools, either DCPS or public charter schools, for pre-K, either 3- or 4-year-old pre-K. So our overall student enrollment was 83,000 in this last year. Nearly 12,000 of those kids are 3- and 4-year-olds. So what that means in terms of the future for what we see, again, both in terms of student achievement, given all that we know about the impact of high quality programs, and we'll talk about quality in a second, at pre-K, the impact that that has on kids later on, but also for families that may not be sure if they want to take the plunge on staying in the city as their kids get to school age. We are seeing a real shift where families are saying, well, hey, all of these options available to me for public pre-K, we're going to stick around and see how that goes. And that itself is a significant boost for schools that then have kids for much longer, are able to move them along. But also it's been a really positive thing for the city. So in terms of pre-K, I want to talk a little bit about reach. So the number of kids, that we're looking at, and you can see that this is really significant chunk. We now have around 95%, maybe a little more than that, of our 4-year-olds are enrolled in public pre-K, almost all in schools. We do have an additional, above this number you see here, we've got an additional almost 2,000 kids who are in publicly funded pre-K in community-based organizations. But we've really incentivized the placing of pre-K in schools, and I'll talk a little bit about how, but we're reaching lots of kids. And even our 3-year-olds, we are now hovering around 80% of our 3-year-olds are in publicly funded pre-K. So we have not just sort of universal access, we have families who are availing themselves of this, and we are seeing, we're getting to the point now where it's going to be very difficult to do research studies for comparing a kid who didn't have pre-K to a kid who did, because in DC we're getting close to the point where everybody does. Your N size is going to be too small for the kids who didn't experience pre-K. So I talked about the vast majority of kids, pre-K kids, are enrolled in public schools. Why does that matter, and what are the implications of that? I think that has played out in some significant ways. So one, there's sort of a focus and culture piece around having pre-K in a school where parents are viewing this and are connecting this to school the way they're thinking about 2nd grade and 5th grade and 8th grade. This is just going to school. It's different than a mindset of I'm dropping my kid at daycare. And I actually think that has shifted the outlook for families as much as anything in terms of what the kinds of expectations are. part of putting pre-K in schools, and this is also outlined in some of DC's sort of legislative pieces that undergird all of this, is setting certain expectations around things like teacher quality, where there's an expectation that teachers have a bachelor's degree, that you have certified teachers. Now, we all know that teacher certification sometimes is not the best measure of teacher effectiveness, but there are certain standards that you're getting folks who are more highly educated, serving in those roles. And so we expect that the teachers who are working with 3-year-olds themselves have training in child development and actually are really prepared to be able to approach this from an educational perspective. So I think that's really important. There's some pieces that having pre-K in schools and connecting it to the academic notion of schools there's a piece of that I think is incredibly valuable and has driven this sort of mindset that I talked about. I actually also think there's some real risks to that, and I'll come back to that in a second, talking about quality, about people thinking that going to pre-K as a 3-year-old is just the same as going to 9th grade. But let me take a second to talk about resources. So the other thing that we really benefit by housing pre-K in our public schools, DCPS and charter, is some of the infrastructure that brings to the table. So most of our pre-Ks, and Jack's program is actually an exception, although sort of morphing on this, most of our pre-Ks are part of elementary schools. So we have very few standalone schools that are just pre-K programs. And so those schools are able to, the pre-K programs are able to then leverage the infrastructure that you have in a broader school. And some of that is just basic efficiency that you can get, but some of it is some of the services that can be really useful for pre-K kids that allows you easier access. So things like the nurses contract that schools have, that the city has for nurses in schools, we can leverage that for developmental screenings for early childhood, so that we're ensuring that we're catching as many kids as early as possible to identify any additional needs they have and getting them into early intervention. So there are a number of ways in which you can really leverage infrastructure. But most importantly, I would say it's around the per pupil funding. So the way we fund our 3- and 4-year-olds is the same way we fund our kindergarten, 7th grade, et cetera, in terms of having a per pupil funding level set for kids. Now, the per pupil funding level for pre-K is higher than most other grade levels because it costs more to effectively deliver a pre-K program. You need low student-teacher ratios. We, in fact, require low student-teacher ratios because we know it really, really matters for our very youngest kids. And so we currently, for the upcoming year, the allocation per pupil for kids, whether they're in a DCPS school or a public charter school, is $12,700 for 3-year-olds, $12,300 for 4-year-olds, and that's before you add on some additional things. If you have students who are English language learners, they'll get a bump above that. We've introduced a new at-risk weight for kids whose families are in TANF, SNAP, homeless, foster kids, and overage high school kids. So that's an extra $2,000 for each of those kids. Certainly our kids with special needs have additional weights. But just your run-of-the-mill 3-year-old is coming with a pretty good price tag, or a pretty good funding stream when you look at how this is funded in other places. And I think it is really important to note that you can't do this stuff on the cheap. You just can't. And even with what I think is very generous funding that DC provides, we know that our schools are still figuring out ways to get other resources and leverage other resources to be able to do it well. Now, while you can't do it on the cheap, you can spend that much money and not really get much out of it. And so that's where the quality piece that I think is for us in DC, we've got resources that we've allocated in significant ways. We are reaching all these kids. But what we need to really double down on is the quality piece. And so the paper that Kara is going to be presenting later looks at one program in DC that has done a phenomenal job of ensuring that the curricular pieces are in place to make sure kids are getting what they need. And to think about that broadly, here's where I want to go back to the notion of pre-K in a school, so you're thinking about it as this academic experience. Now, pre-K should prepare kids to excel in kindergarten and beyond, academically and in lots of other ways. There are a lot of folks who translate that into a pre-K classroom is just a first grade classroom, but with shorter people. And so you will see pre-K classrooms where kids are sitting in rows, and you really shouldn't be doing that in a first grade classroom either. But and teachers are engaging in direct instruction and not letting kids spend a lot of time talking and using language. And what we know, of course, is that kids learn differently at different ages, and the developmental needs of 3- and 4-year-olds are such that we have to be paying attention to the very different kinds of methods that you want to use if you want to get great outcomes. So all those of you who are parents in the room, if your kids were ever enrolled in some kind of preschool program, and you went in to a program, your gut would probably tell you a lot of the things that we know around the importance of play-based instruction. I mean, obviously, if you're going to get a 3-year-old to engage in something, it's got to be joyful, and you have to have, and kids learn through play. We know that, and yet, lots of teachers spend time trying to drill things into kids' heads in a way that is not allowing them to have the kind of language experience that's really going to develop their brains, and the kind of practice at social interaction that is going to build the sort of self-regulation skills that we know are as good of a predictor of success later in life as academic skills. We know that the kids need to learn those kinds of things, and we need to teach them those things, and we can. So a focused curriculum that thinks about the academic and non-academic skills that 3- and 4-year-olds need to succeed later on, and intentionally incorporates those skills and skill building opportunities into their program. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a curriculum that is really going to achieve results. That is different than trying to translate teaching methods that you use for older kids down to younger kids. And I would say that as I go into classrooms across the district, that's the part that we really need to focus on moving forward. So we can have all the kids there, and we can know that they're safe and that it allows their parents to go to work, and that is all good. But we are not going to be getting the return on this investment if we're not thinking really carefully about the programmatic side and what is actually happening in those classrooms. And there's some parents who go into a classroom and say, well, all they were doing was playing, right? Well, hopefully, if you know something about early childhood and you go into a classroom, you can quickly see, was it that all they were doing is playing and their kids just kind of, smacking each other on the head with blocks? Or was there very intentional play going on where teachers are taking advantage of every opportunity to engage with kids and to expose them to different ways of thinking and approaching tasks and that sort of thing. So I know that you all will be interested to hear the sort of case study looking at Appletree and what has happened there. Appletree has one of several curriculums that's in use right now in DC, and I think we have a lot to learn from them, and a lot to learn generally about what really works at early childhood. I want to say one other thing about the sort of programmatic side, and that's about how, in fact, we measure those outcomes. And there's been, a lot of research that has been done on early childhood. There have been some longitudinal studies that have shown us that, just having a program isn't good enough. It's got to be a program that has particular things that are going to actually make a difference. That's helpful. But I actually think we have an immense amount to learn about the connection between what's actually happening in pre-K classrooms and what those outcomes look like later on. And one of the things that many people are allergic to when they hear about early childhood is the notion of assessing young children. And part of it is, I think, when people imagine, assessment, they're thinking that, you're sitting down some 3-year-old and you're saying, okay, here we go, we're now going to do this, and, you're giving them a little bubble sheet or something. Clearly, you have to do assessment also in a developmentally appropriate way, and that, I think, is actually addressed somewhat in Kara's paper as well. But I think that we at our peril, do we sort of make the perfect the enemy of the good on the assessment front in pre-K. And I mean that in a few ways. One, we should be assessing kids, and we should be assessing them in ways where kids have no idea they're being assessed, and that are really looking at, at the particular growth areas we want for kids. But we also should not be afraid to assess those things that we don't yet have the best measures for. So another area of big discussion on the pre-K front has been, and this has been something that we've struggled with in DC, the Public Charter School Board has really struggled with this in developing their performance management framework for early childhood, is how do we measure social emotional learning? We know it's important. We know that it is critically important for 3- and 4-year-olds in terms of their brain development to really develop the sort of self-regulation skills that are going to set them up for success later. And we know that teachers spend time doing it because they know it's important. We don't have great measures of it. And so one of the things that we tend to do in those situations say, well, then we just can't measure it. We don't want to measure it because, we're not sure how reliable those measures are. And I actually think that's the wrong way to go. I think that we need to keep working to measure these things that we know are important because there are other things that indicate they're going to be important. And even though we're not positive that the instrument that we're using to measure them is as reliable as we want it to be, this is how we're going to learn this stuff. And I think shying away from it and saying we're just not going to assess kids on those fronts, is problematic. I want to pivot for a minute, and how am I doing on time? I'm just like yammering. About 5 more minutes. All right. I'm going to pivot a little bit to just spend the last couple of minutes talking a little bit around this issue of public charter schools and district and school district and how they interact outside of the early childhood context, although certainly early childhood is involved in there. As I mentioned, we're at 44% public charter in terms of our student enrollment in DC. And that has led us to have to ask a bunch of hard questions and think about things a little differently than when we had 10% or 15% of our kids in charters. It has created new questions around what the implications of competition are. And what that means in terms of stewardship of public resources and that sort of thing. So I want to just highlight a couple of those things and sort of leave people with those thoughts. One is in terms of what we've done in DC, there are a few areas where I think we've done some really exciting positive things in terms of how we as a public sector think about charter schools as a part of our public school system and not as on the side. One thing that we just instituted this year for the first time is a common application and lottery for families across both DC public schools and public charter schools. In the past, if you were interested in going to a public charter school, you would go to every single one and you would apply to them all separately, and then you would apply to your DCPS out-of-boundary schools separately, and then you might get accepted into 3 schools or you might get accepted into 0 schools, and then the mad scramble would begin. And what we did this year for the first time was to pull together all DCPS schools and all charter schools that wanted to participate, which turned out to be almost all of them. And parents could go online in one place, put in their children's information one time, and choose up to 12 schools. Just rank, this is the school I most want to go to, and on down the list. And then there was an algorithm that maximized the number of kids who got placed in seats through a unified lottery. So it's a very operational way of connecting the sectors, but one that has a significant impact on families in terms of ease of access to the system. When parents are saying, you know, I'm not looking at whether it's a public charter school or a DCPS school, I'm trying to find a good school for my kid. And I don't care so much about governance structure, I care about the quality of the school, however I define that as a parent. And this allows parents to access that. But it also allows schools to deal with some of what has become some inefficiencies in the system, even in terms of what we call the waitlist shuffle for schools. So one of the things that is as important as anything to any school, but particularly public charter schools who are able to control their enrollment, is the ability to know how many kids am I going to get, and who are they, and knowing that early on. And that's something that, you know, that we've been able to really support through this common application and lottery. Another area that has been a point of contention, but that I think we've made a lot of progress on, is school facilities. So DCPS, over the last number of years, has closed a whole lot of school buildings, and about 30 of them are now occupied by public charter schools. We are actually just about to put out 4 more, Skip. And it's been as I said, a point of contention where a lot of people think you can't give all these buildings away, and a lot of other people think, why aren't you giving them away faster? But it's something that, that I think is really important to look at as, again, a steward of public resources. We have public buildings that are sitting there, not serving kids, and we've got schools that are serving kids in church basements. And it makes a whole lot more sense for us to have the facilities allotment that we provide to charter schools go into public school buildings. And then the last thing I'll end on, because it's something that we talked about today at the press conference when we released the DC CAS, is figuring out new ways to think about partnership and collaboration between public charter schools and school districts. And the school that we had our press conference at this morning is Stanton Elementary School, which is a DCPS school, but is operated by a charter operator, Scholar Academies, which started in Philadelphia and now runs a charter school in DC and is the operator of a DCPS school. And that school, Stanton, has seen incredible gains over the last 4 years since Scholar Academies was there. Now, let's be clear that they started out in single digits in terms of proficiency on math and reading. And so the fact that they have increased by, I think, 25 points in one and 19 points in another, which is an incredible increase. Their proficiency rates are still very low. But that kind of willingness on the part of both DCPS, but also on the part of a charter operator to say, all right, we're both going to need to give a little bit on how this is all going to work, but we think that there's a way to provide this neighborhood school of right and all the things that means on the district side with some of the benefits that a charter can provide. And the charter being willing to give on some of the things that make it difficult to run a neighborhood school of right, but because they really believe that they could bring to the table some real strengths. So I'm going to stop there, and I feel like I kind of covered the waterfront here, but hopefully that gave folks a little bit of a taste of what's going on in DC.